Very quickly before we get started, I just wanted to thank everyone who's been so supportive of the new Darkness book. It is greatly appreciated. If you have picked up the book, I would love it if you could leave a review on Amazon. Reviews are how these things get noticed by the rest of the site, so they really mean a lot. So if you have a moment, please head over to Amazon and leave a review for Darkness, Fairy Tales for Unwanted Children. Thank you very much. Periodically Productions presents Fairy Tales for Unwanted Children. Quiet. Written and read by Scott Thrower. Once upon a time, there was a wife and a husband, and more than that, there was an argument. Neither could remember how it started, or even narrow it down to when, but this argument rose out of bed with them in the morning and settled down to sleep with them at night. It followed them through their chores and travels, lingered like the scent of skunk when they were apart, and rattled the windows when they were together. It was such a force in their lives that the neighbors kept their windows shut even on the hottest of nights, because the argument created noise at unusual hours, and it was very hard to ignore. One day, when the husband was making bread and the wife was canning preserves, the husband found himself shouting about the stacked dishes next to the sink while being shouted at regarding the state of the garden. Out of sheer exhaustion, he declared a minute of silence and turned over the hourglass beside the oven. And just like that, the argument went away. Husband and wife stared at each other across their small kitchen, finding that the quiet did not give them peace. Instead, they had time to arm themselves with their next retorts and form lists of past misdeeds that were ripe to bring back into the light. As the moment stretched, he felt a tightening in his neck and she a tightening to her chest, both building towards the moment the silence broke and the argument returned. But around the time the minute should have ended, the husband glanced down and found that just a few grains of sand had reached the bottom of the hourglass, the rest still perched in the top, waiting to fall. He leaned in close just in time to see another grain drop, and it floated down like a feather in a breeze. And so the argument stayed away. After a few minutes, he returned to his bread, finding it hard to get the dough to a window pane stretch when his eyes were continually drawn back to the hourglass and his hands weren't fueled by the fight. She returned to her canning, completing the task without shattering a single jar for the first time in years. They ate dinner with the hourglass between them, watching individual grains tumble down with such irregular slowness until finally she reached out to give it a tap without any obvious result. At last she opened her mouth to point out that he must have turned it over wrong. But while the words formed on her tongue, she found herself unable to speak them. Pulling back from the table, the wife pointed at her throat, and when the husband tried to snap at her for her silly prank, he ended up staggering back as well, just as mute as she. So began a long evening, during which the hourglass was turned over and over again, thrown against the stone floor, tossed into the fire, stomped underfoot, and pressed against the pages of a holy book found in the back of a drawer. By the end of it, a few more grains of sand had fallen into the bottom bulb, and both the husband and wife seethed with anger, though this time not directed towards each other. They fell asleep in the early hours, angry and terrified, both hoping things would be different in the morning. Dawn was an odd thing. As each woke, they looked over at the hourglass on the dresser to see no noticeable change, and then flopped their heads back on their pillows and listened to the quiet. A bee lazily rebounded off the window. Birds chirped in the overgrown oak that scraped against the shutters, and the neighbors chatted happily in their garden about their unexpectedly restful night's sleep. But it was different inside, in the stillness of their bedroom. Each knew the other was awake, staring up at the same ceiling, but it was such a queer experience to do so knowing that the argument wasn't there between them, anxiously awaiting to begin again. That strangeness was between them instead. changing the way he toasted the bread with a bit more attention to the way she liked it, and making her morning bath a bit more relaxed since his voice wasn't invading through the wall. In fact, for a moment she forgot he was in the house at all. As she left for work, she had to catch his attention with a wave of her hand instead of a shout from the threshold. And she had to do the same when she returned, standing on the back step with a raised hand as he weeded the garden. Not being able to talk at work led to a number of stories, and in the absence of the argument, she actually had time to tell them, resorting to a sort of silly mime to do so. While she was lousy at it, he found himself forgiving her, because he was in the same situation and not very good at it either. It wasn't perfect. The smell of him after a hot day in the sun was annoying, but without a good way to express it, she had to let it go. Besides which, without the argument stretching out all of their chores, he found himself with time for a bath of his own shortly after dinner. He was still annoyed by her half-read books scattered around the house. But when he found one on his chair by the fire and held it up with frustration, the inability to complain ran across his face in such a comical way that she laughed, and a moment later, he joined her in it. There was a brief hint of the argument as he considered tossing the book in the fire, but then he considered his peaceful day and set the thought aside as he did the same with the book. As they went up to bed that night, both wondered how much sand had moved through the course of the day, and both found themselves hoping the answer was none. The next day, they awoke to just a few more grains in the bottom of the glass. He annoyed her with the way he chewed his toast with his mouth open, and she frustrated him by wasting too much coal on the fire. But neither brought it up because the effort would just be too great. They accepted those bumps and moved on with a sigh. They also noticed things. She noticed that his eyes crinkled at the corner more than they had when they'd met, and he noticed a few strands of gray in her hair. She rubbed at a pain in her palm that he hadn't noticed before, and he turned his head to the window with a ghost of a smile whenever a bird landed on the sill. She also noticed that he cared about the way the chairs were set against the table, very primly centered against the edge, for the first time really seeing the importance of order in his life. He watched her face as she set aside a book after morning reading, an immediate nostalgia that quickly formed into a theory. Perhaps she had so many books on the go because she wanted to hold on to each world just as long as she could. Before she left for work and he went to tend the garden, they were startled by a knock at the door. It seemed louder than any knock ever had because it intruded on the quiet crackle of the fire and the song of a robin rather than the customary bickering. An older woman who lived next door stood on the stoop with a look of concern and a cake wrapped in paper. She looked very well rested indeed. "Just wanted to check in," she said, looking carefully from husband to wife, as if surprised to find them home at all. "It's been a while since I've popped by, and things have been so quiet." They invited her in, sitting side by side on a bench as she sat on the edge of a chair. They smiled at her and beamed as they unwrapped the cake, but they could not thank her. They couldn't say a word. Their guest said uncertainly, "Is everything all right?" With that, the husband held up a finger and dashed upstairs for the hourglass, and when he returned, he set it down between them, as his wife attempted to explain the situation using mime and facial expressions. Though of course she wasn't very good, and he tried to help wherever possible. Eventually, the neighbor got the idea, and she leaned in to watch a grain of sand lazily drifting down to the meager pile. Her face went pale, and while she forced a smile, the woman suddenly remembered something still baking at home and made a hasty retreat. Husband turned to wife, and both of them shrugged. But news of the curse reached the village before the wife arrived at work. The other clerks in the store, who'd thought her merely sick the day before, now clustered together with dark whispers. And while many shoppers came to the window to peer in, by noon there hadn't been a single sale. The woman found herself dismissed, walking home with her final pay and a cloud of curious people following in her wake. The husband's morning was not much different. Boys of the village showed up to see if the curse was real, and when their questions failed to make the husband speak, they tried again with stones. When his wife returned, she found him locked inside the house with the curtains drawn, nursing a bump on the side of his head and peeking out at his tomatoes, which had been trampled in an attempt to make him talk. But still, only a few more grains of sand had fallen, and the upper bulb continued to hold the vast majority suspended. The quiet of the house was different for the rest of the day, no longer a delicate novelty, punctuated by knocks at the door or taunts from the edge of the road. Dinner was interrupted by a rock through the front window, but all they could do was plead for peace, silently, from the porch, while a growing crowd watched in fascinated horror. That night, they went to bed listening to voices outside the house, and neither got much sleep. They rose before dawn and started packing their things into bags they could easily carry. The husband sorted through the garden for whatever food could be salvaged under the cover of night, while the wife hid the valuables they couldn't carry under the floors, where they'd be unlikely to be found. Only a few stragglers had camped the night on the couple's front lawn, and they crept past these like ghosts, following the road off and away, not knowing exactly where they'd go. But their story had spread, and when they reached the next town late in the morning, heads turned towards them. By the time he stepped out of the pawn shop, having traded his father's watch for whatever he could silently negotiate, a crowd had formed. His wife held her shoulders back defiantly, but when he put an arm around her, he found that she was shaking, and he had to swallow the fury as they turned away. Angry voices called for them to leave, not wanting the curse to spread, and so they bought what they needed and fled this village as well. That night, they slept under a pine tree that did very little to keep out the rain, huddled together for warmth. She only knew he was crying when his shoulders shook, and she held on to him like an anchor. The storm broke just before dawn, and as they crawled out into the morning light, he looked so miserable that her heart nearly broke in two. Without words, she saw only one way to soothe him, and she rose up on her toes with a kiss. 58 seconds later, as the husband and wife stared into each other's eyes, the hourglass tucked inside his bag finally dropped the last grain of sand into the bottom bulb. There was a feeling like a butterfly in the back of their throats, and all at once they were laughing and screaming with joy. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her on the forest path like they were young, and she snatched up the hourglass from his bag and shattered it against a rock. And then they started the long walk home, her hand in his, talking the entire way about his plans to rebuild the garden, and hers to regain her job, things they wanted to accomplish and the trips they planned to take. The house was in shambles. The mob had been through looking for tokens of the cursed family, smashing the preserves and fouling the rugs. Most of her hiding spots hadn't been found, so many of their valuables were still in place. But there was a great deal of work to do to set things to right, and both were too exhausted to do it. So they sat in their chairs by the fire and appreciated the feeling of being warm. Until she noticed the smell of him hanging in the air. And he heard the hum she made when she read. They looked up at each other, him seeing the gray in her hair and her seeing the crinkles around his eyes. It was then that the argument sat down between them. Did you find a moral for this week's story? Let us know on Twitter at periodicallypod, or join the Fairy Tales for Unwanted discussion group on Facebook. For more fairy tales for unwanted children, join us at unwantedchildren.ca.